I remember when I was 16 years old, which is when you first start thinking most deeply about romance, I was hired along with 39 other teenagers, 20 boys, 20 girls, and I was so excited because I thought statistically one of those girls is meant for me. And it was not to be. There was a young man there who was very handsome, and he took an inordinate share of the girls' interests away from people like me. But it was nevertheless a good summer working up there at Indiana Dunes National Lake Shore. It was my first time away from home for any length of time except for vacations, which were always family events with familiar people. So when I went up there, I was worried about not knowing anyone and whether or not I would make any friends. And this turned out to be true for all the teenagers who were there. It was a new land for all of us, with all of the attendant anxieties one experiences in new and different situations. I shared a dorm room with 5 other boys, each of us assigned a cot and a footlocker to store our belongings. And one of my roommates was named Doug Abernathy, a young black man who lived in East Chicago, the only black person I had known up until then was Doc Foster, who collected the trash in our town, who gave me my first bicycle, built from bicycle parts that he had found at the town dump and cobbled together into a bicycle for me. It had everything but a seat, one not being available, just a seat post, which I only sat on once after hitting a pothole, and then learned to ride standing up. But my roommate Doug was very kind-hearted and smart as a whip, thoughtful. He seldom talked about himself, being far more inclined to ask us questions about ourselves, where we were from, how many siblings we had, the things we liked and disliked. And Doug is still that way. We've remained friends, and not long ago we went to the farmhouse for an overnight trip, and Doug is still asking questions, still shining the light on others and never himself, even though he has been very successful in life and has a lot to brag about. Would he want to, but he never does. There was another roommate whose name was Mike, and Mike knew everything. Mike knew how everything was done, what everyone should think, and never hesitated to tell you everything on subjects he knew nothing about. I am convinced that whoever coined the term mansplaining had Mike in mind. For those of you who don't know what mansplaining is, I'm going to mansplain and tell you. It's when a man explains something to someone, usually a woman, in a condescending or patronizing manner. Here's an example of mansplaining. Last Monday night, Phil mansplained to Joanne how to balance a checkbook, though she has been managing their finances for 40 years. That's an example of mansplaining. Boy, did I get a look on that one. So Mike was a mansplainer. We called him Mike the Answer Man, always pontificating. Think Rush Limbaugh and Jerry Falwell rolled into one. Like the cicada, these folks seem to emerge in cycles, especially during seasons of change and cultural anxiety, when they take it upon themselves to tell the rest of us who to hate and what to fear. They are, to quote a popular saying, often wrong, but never in doubt. We're thinking these days about the do's and don'ts during times of change. So today I would like to suggest a helpful pattern. During seasons of change, it is better to ask more questions than to give more answers. To be more like Doug and less like Mike. Here's an example. This past week, I was with a small group of people, and the topic of religion came up. This is because they knew I was a pastor, and they think the only thing I'm interested in is religion, so the topic came up. And one of the persons present was very Baptist. Now, that covers a wide range of territory. But he was not Jimmy Carter Baptist. He was more Pat Robertson Baptist. And he began talking about wives submitting to their husbands. And just as I was getting ready to ask if he had always been misogynistic, or was that a new development, another man present asked him, "Is that the way you grew up?" And the man said, "Yeah, that's how I grew up." And the guy said, "Did that work for your parents? Did they have a happy marriage?" And the man thought about it for a bit, and he said, "You know, it really wasn't that warm of a marriage." And the man asked him, "Are you the head of your household?" And the man thought, and he said, "You know," and I commend him for his honesty, "now that I think about it, I guess my wife and I talk about things and we decide together what to do." And I just sat there listening, marveling that within the space of 3 questions, he had helped this man understand that despite his words to the contrary, he actually admitted he and his wife were partners in their marriage. A realization he would never have arrived at if I had been in charge of the conversation. In times of uncertainty and change, questions expand understanding. Answers diminish it. Questions open doors. Answers often shut them. Here are some things I'm learning not to say, and some questions I'm learning to ask instead. I'm learning not to say, "The person you're voting for is a fascist, or a communist, or a socialist." You can fill in the blank. Instead, I'm learning to ask, what about that person appeals to you? I'm learning not to say, "The rich should pay more taxes." Instead, I'm learning to ask, if it were up to you, how would you raise the money we need? I'm learning not to say, unless you're a Native American, you or your ancestor was an immigrant. Instead, I'm learning to ask, what are the things that would motivate you to move to another country? I'm learning not to say, your beliefs about God are antiquated and nonsensical. Instead, I'm learning to ask, what do you hope God is like? I'm learning not to say, we need to outlaw guns, no one should be allowed to have them. Instead, I'm learning to ask, do you feel safe? I'm learning not to say, you're crazy, or what in the world are you thinking, or have you always been this dumb? Instead, I'm learning to ask maybe the most important question of all. Tell me what's important to you and why. Tell me what's important to you and why. Learning to be a Doug, not a Mike. To be quick to ask questions and slower, much slower, to tell people what they should believe, how they should vote, and what they should think. Since questions open doors when answers almost always slam them shut.